Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. This webinar will talk you through the EU-funded standardization work, and more in particular, will guide you or give you information about the IPR commercial and financial implications. My name is Elsa, and I will be moderating this webinar. Now, before we start, I would like to remind you that you're all muted, so you do not have the possibility to speak out loud, but you can enter your questions in the question and answer panel of the GoToWebinar control panel. We will then have a look at the questions after the presentation and give you an answer as good as possible, of course. Should you be on Twitter, you're always free to tweet about this topic with the handle @standards4EU. So let me present you the speakers of today. We have three of them. My colleague Spiro is Project Manager, Legal and Strategy and Governance. Constant is a Project Manager in the Industry and Electrotechnology Department. And then there is Bertrand, Account Manager for Finance. So please, guys, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you, Els.
Perhaps this is Spiro, by the way, just to give, I think it would be good to give an overview of what this webinar is going to be about, what is the scope, and also the items that we're going to touch upon, so that you also have the appropriate expectations of the outcome. So the purpose of this webinar is to explain how the process for the development of harmonized standards takes place, but particularly with regard to issues related to IPR, the appropriate referencing of standards, the commercial, financial aspects as well. So it is really specifically for that specific scope, not, for example, to address issues of how you can get financing. This is certainly something very interesting. However, if anyone has questions with regard to those aspects, this can be addressed separately offline with questions that you can address also to my colleague Bertrand, and we will have contacts of appropriate colleagues later in the presentation as well. But indeed, the scope today is first of all to go and understand first of all how the European standardization system works, the framework, the approach, how standards are referenced or should be referenced in legislation, so raise some issues there and define how the appropriate approach will be and what are the consequences if it doesn't happen in the appropriate way. Then further, to define the process for the acceptance of the standardization request and issues that need to be raised there when the requests are being considered by SEN and SENELEC. Further that, I will explain a bit the process for the EU funding for the contracts that are being developed and finalized between SEN, SENELEC, and the European Commission and the members, issues that are important there for you to be aware and pay attention to, particularly for the scope which we defined earlier in this presentation. Further on to that, it is important to understand after that how the standards are developed and how the IPR of the standard is being established, the copyright of the standard is being established, and eventually how standards are being disseminated at national level by our members. So some aspects there which are very important to define, and the benefits of having this national distribution of standards. So with that, I think we can give the floor to Constant and explain a bit the first aspect regarding the voluntary nature of European standards.
Yeah, thank you very much, Spiro. So my name is Constant. I work as project manager in the Standardization Department of SEN and SENELEC. So thank you for this opportunity to set the scene a bit for the on the European standardization system, and notably to address the voluntary nature of European standard, which is one of the key assets of the European standardization system. So I just want to recap some key principles before we go really deeply in the issues that Spiro explained. So as you know, we are SEN and SENELEC and the European Standardization Organization together with ETSI, and as recognized by the Regulation 1025 of the European Union. What is important for us and for you to know is that we work based on the national delegation principle, which means that every decision, every standard we publish every decision we make in the context of standardization requests, for instance, are based on the decision of our members, which we execute at CCMC. As you know, as well, standard are technical specification which define requirements for product, services, process or test methods. They are developed by the industry, and what we call the industry is all the market players which are involved in Europe, and following principle of consensus, openness, transparency. As you know as well, standard ensure interoperability and safety. They reduce cost and facilitate the integration of organization in the value chain. They also facilitate trade. And so here comes really the topic of the voluntary nature of European standard, which is a principle which shall be safeguarded, because this is one of the key assets of the European standardization system, notably because it allows the possibility to adjust and adapt technical requirements to the state of the art in a very flexible way. And with the objective that innovative solution can be promoted and disseminated within the European single market. So there's a clear difference between standard and legislation, for instance, but both are closely related, and standard can support the implementation of European legislation or European policies. So in that context, you can see that standardization, be it European or international, are powerful tools for the industry, of course, when it comes to interoperability, safety, etc. But it's also a powerful tool and strategic tool for improving the efficiency of European policies and legislation. So standardization is a dimension which is really important for the European Commission and policymakers in general, because standardization can influence most areas of public concern, such as competitiveness of industry, the functioning of the single market, but also environment, health, or innovation. So for you to know, to continue to set the scene, there is a regulation 1025 from 2012, which is in place and which sets the general framework for European standardization. And this regulation notably addresses the financing of European standardization. So this is something that will be further developed later on, but the financing of European standardization has different objectives, and one of those is to support the co-development of European standards which are suitable and necessary for the support to union legislation or policies. And so, as I mentioned, support may be granted for the development or revision of European standards which support those policy objectives. They can be based on standardization requests, or they can be developed without a standardization request. We will also further explain later on the process to go through those standardization requests. So, Spiro, maybe if you can go to the next slide. I just want to show you this connection between standardization and law, because as you know, standardization and the final product developed by the European Standardization Organization are European standards. And basically, this is the results of different approaches, different practices developed by companies, so that we can define one single European standardization solution. And so, and this is why it can be developed in support of European legislation. As I mentioned as well, standardization requests can be also the basis for the development of European standards, which means that manufacturers or market players can use European standards to demonstrate that products, services, or processes comply with the relevant European legislation, and of which the references are published in the official journal of the European Union. So we have examples like the Low Voltage Directive, Radio Equipment Directive, medical devices, or machinery. Some standardization requests also address the development of European standards, but which will not provide presumption of conformity, but will stimulate the development of standards where gaps exist. And for instance, the mandate or the standardization request we had on digital signatures. Funding can also be provided by the European Commission when no standardization request exists, provided that the standardization project can be funded can demonstrate relevant support to speak European policies, and by making reference to the Union Work Program or the kind of for ICT standardization, for instance. So, in a nutshell, finalize my presentation, my first part. The funding for the co-development of standardization is something that is really important and which contributes to the efficiency of the European standardization system. The funding provided by the Commission can facilitate the development of the standard and can financially support the work of experts and editors within the technical committee. So it's really about co-developing the standard. And on the side of the European Standardization Organization, incur the expense to support the development of those to the building of the consensual process. So on the ISO side and on the national standardization body side, efforts are needed to support the drafting of the standard to make this consensus happen. And this can take place in various forms. It can be for the database management, the proceeding of the balloting to reach consensus, the handling of the comment, the editing and the publishing of the standard. So you can see that when financing of the European Commission is involved, we really enter into a co-development process where all the actors involved in European standardization work together to make consensus happen in the most efficient way.
Thank you, Constant. Let me go now to the next part. So, as Constant mentioned, this is the role of the European standardization system of SEN and SENLEC in particular, and particularly for standards and harmonized standards. There is a specific legislation, Regulation 1025 of 2012, and this is the cornerstone at the moment for the development of harmonized standards. And it's very important because this piece of legislation specifically defines that standards are voluntary and they are market-driven. So what this means is that standards offer a presumption of conformity with the relevant legislation to which they may be considered, and this means that the operators, the users, have the possibility to either use a standard in order to demonstrate compliance with specific legislation or policies, or they can develop their own solutions different than what the standard prescribes in order to show compliance with the relevant legislation. At the same time, standards are market-driven. What this means is that industry and stakeholders, they come together within the European standardization system and they develop specific solutions which they think are suitable for their purposes. And that means that there is indeed an appeal and a need in the market to implement a specific technical solution. At the same time, the regulation, the EU Regulation 1025, defines that the European standardization system is and has to be open, transparent, and inclusive. So the added value of the European standardization system of SEN and SENLEC is that they offer by default a system of openness, transparency and inclusiveness, which perhaps is not always the case in standardization organizations in other countries, perhaps, or private consortia. The European standardization system guarantees that there is access to stakeholders, companies, organizations, to ensure that the results also reflect the consensus of the various participants in the standardization system. It is also very important to note that from the total deliverables, the total number of standards produced by SEN and SENLEC, around 20% are developed following requests from the European Commission and EFTA. So the other 80% are not harmonized standards, are purely European standards which serve the needs of the industry and stakeholders based on their specific solutions that they have decided to develop, and do not necessarily aim to support specific legislation for that purpose. So I think the two aspects we need to take away from this part is that standards are not legislation; they're voluntary technical solutions which support the implementation of legislation. So this doesn't mean that they become legislation automatically. Why this is important? What are the benefits of this? The fact that standards are based on consensus, it means that they reflect on the wide experience of the implementation by industry and stakeholders in the market. Also, at the same time, they reduce the legal compliance and verification costs. So when someone, a company or individual implements a standard in their business, by taking advantage of the presumption of conformity, automatically this reduces the compliance cost since they do not need to develop something on their own. It's something which they can develop themselves. At the same time, it increases transparency in the market. Due to the guarantees offered by the European Standardization System for openness and transparency, it means that there is an open dialogue and discussion at the forum, the relevant technical committees at SEN and CERLEC, where the technical solutions are being discussed and developed on a consensus basis. At the same time, it means that it opens the markets for industries and various SMEs and companies. For example, when a European standard is being implemented, considering that the European standards may also be implemented in Europe but also outside Europe, it means that companies have the possibility to sell their products across Europe but also outside Europe. Also consider that sometimes European standards get also adopted at international level by ISO and IC. So what this means is that the same technical solution is going to be implemented internationally in these cases, and therefore there is a clear benefit for European industry to be able to sell its products on the basis of the implementation of the European standards. At the same time, it promotes innovation as well because it establishes a common approach for implementation. Based on this, companies and stakeholders can develop different solutions and promote the innovation with that regard. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it is very important here to specify that European standards support the legislation. They do not intend to replace the legislation, but rather provide a way, a pathway, a tool to implement legislation with that regard. Now, we have seen cases where sometimes regulators and policymakers, either at the European or international or national level, do not always use standards or do not reference them in a way which offers the maximum potential for their implementation. For example, there are some cases where there might be ambiguous references to standards in legislation or policies. There might be outdated references because, for example, a legislation may reference directly a standard of, let's say, 2004. However, a new version of 2014 may have been developed and published by SEN and CERLEC. In this case, there is a clear mismatch between the market perspective and the market needs and the specific provisions of legislation. So there is a difference in the development phases of these two pieces of text. There might be also cases of references to foreign standards. This is problematic since, as I mentioned earlier, the European Standardization System guarantees the inclusiveness, openness, and transparency. This may not be always the same for other foreign standardization organizations. So referencing may bring stakeholders to a position where they will have perhaps less influence to define the content of these deliverables, but also to get access to these deliverables. Because in Europe, organizations know that whenever they need to get a standard, they have the possibility to get them directly nationally from the national standardization bodies and national committees, members of SEN and CENELEC. There might be also reference to other specifications which are not recognized European standards. This can be problematic, as I mentioned earlier, because it doesn't guarantee that the development has been done in a way which Regulation 35 provides for the high bar set by the regulation for SEN, CENELEC, and EXI. Also, another very important problem which we have seen sometimes is that standards are, in some cases, made mandatory through reference to legislation. And this recently was the case, for example, of the invoicing deliverables. In this case, there was a specific directive which made the invoicing standards deliverables developed by SEN mandatory due to the fact that they were the language and the text which the directive was written made this of such nature, and this, as we will see later, creates many and various problems for the industry, but also for SEN and CERNLEC and the members with that regard, and the experts, and eventually ends up being inefficient with that regard. So what do we see then with that regard are the effects of such inappropriate, incoherent rather, inefficient referencing to standards. It means that such references do not support effectively the intended legislative objectives, because it means that the users are locked in to a very specific framework and does not allow for further developments to be taken into account and implemented by the market. Also, it does not facilitate compliance and market surveillance with that regard, because there are often problems with the update of the references which takes place with that regard, and also users do not have the option to choose something different. Maybe users would like to implement their own solution based on that specific conditions they have in their own company and industry, for example. Certainly, it creates red tape and administrative burden, unnecessary costs. It hampers innovation and does not allow alignment of legislation and technology development. Since, as I mentioned, by making a mandatory use and by, for example, having a very specific outdated reference, it means that that specific solution has to be implemented. It doesn't allow for new, innovative, state-of-the-art solutions to be taken into account. It also creates problems because, as we will explain later, there are issues there with regard to the availability of standards in the market and questions there of about what is the law, what is a standard, and how to separate the two. There is the Regulation 225 makes a clear distinction between the two, specifying that harmonized standards are of voluntary nature. So that's very important to implement and take into account. There might be cases where this doesn't happen. That's very problematic, and we need to take steps to address that whenever that is relevant. So instead of having such incoherent and ineffective references, a smart way to do that is to always ensure that standards are of voluntary nature, since this provides an alternative route to the implementation of legislation, different possibilities, offers a presumption of conformity, which is a clear benefit to the market, and a clear understanding of how standards and which standards shall apply with that regard. Also, it is more suitable to consider the indirect reference to standards, for example, through decrees or communication. So not to have a direct reference to a specific standard. For example, policies or legislation would say industry can implement standards which are being referenced, harmonized standards being referenced in the official journal of the EU, for example. And also very important is to delegate powers to regularly update the references. So instead of having a burdensome legislative process to define how and which standards need to be referenced, it would be more efficient and quicker, since this is indeed an issue which has been identified in the standardization system at the moment, how to ensure that the development phase and publication of standard and the referencing is done as quick as possible. It will be more efficient to have a delegation of powers to ensure that the update of the references is done quickly, also aligned with the development phase of the European standards. Now, it is very important here to note for our system in SEN and CERNLEC, what is the role of CCMC and the technical body officers and experts. And I think this is very, very important. Having noted the issues which are raised in the process of referencing of standards in legislation and how standards support legislation, there might be cases where this doesn't happen, or there might be cases where there are discussions to use and reference standards in legislation. In these cases, it is important to take actions at the beginning where this takes place in order to ensure that the follow-up actions and phases are done in an appropriate way to ensure as smooth implementation as possible. In that process, CCMC, so the SEN and CERNLEC Management Center, continuously monitor legislative and policy initiatives. So we have a dedicated team in SEN and CERNLEC, in the CCMC, which is monitoring legislations and tries to identify specific issues which are being raised. Considering, however, that the areas covered by European standardization are so wide, it's not always possible to identify everything. That's why it's always important to have a flow of information and communication between CCMC, but also the relevant technical body officers and experts. The experts are the ones who are on the ground. They know what is happening. They have communication with various other experts and stakeholders, for example, the European Commission or other groups which in the European Parliament or somewhere else, where initiatives start taking shape. Therefore, it is very important that these experts and technical body officers, whenever they receive information about a new legislative initiative or a policy initiative which may be relevant for standardization, it is important that they inform the relevant CCMC project manager and their contact points in CCMC in order to ensure that relevant information are provided to CCMC and accordingly actions are taken to ensure that the dialogue with the European Commission and policymakers is done in a way which guarantees that the appropriate reference standard is taking place. The same also applies at national level. For example, if the experts or technical body officers of national committees they realize at national level that a policy or legislation is about to take place, they also need to contact the national member of SENA-SELEC in order to inform them and take appropriate steps to ensure that any such issues are being avoided. So this is a process which takes place in parallel both at national level but also at European level. So I think with that, I think it's important to go to the next step. So after we kind of discuss and analyze how standards can be used to support legislation, let's see then after the development of legislation or policy initiatives, how standards come into play and how the European Commission comes and addresses the specific needs towards SENA-SELEC.
Thank you, Spiro. So this is Constant again. And I think it's important that we now address the process for standardization requests because it is often the trigger for the development of standardization activities with the financial support of the European Union. Noting that, however, the financial support shall not be a precondition for the acceptance of standardization requests. So in this part, I would like to share with you a bit the role of the actors who are involved in this standardization request processes because it involves many actors like, of course, SEN-SENELEC, the national standardization bodies, the European Commission, but also member states. So I believe it's important to better understand who is doing what in that respect. So the official term as recognized by Regulation 1025 is standardization request, but often we also use the term mandate. So both terminology address the same concept. So standardization request emanating from the European Commission ask for specific action from the European Standardization Organization to support and complement European policy objective. Standardization requests are usually issued to support the implementation of European Union legislation and policies for products and services. So when it comes to the preparation of a standardization request, so as we explained, standardization is based on consensus, on transparency, but this is also a principle that can be applied to the development of standardization requests. So the European Commission is responsible for the preparation and the drafting of the request. And this is something that is done in line with the principle of the vademecum on European standardization, which I invite you to have a look to, which is available on the European Commission and SEN-SELEC websites. But the European Commission is the trigger for the standardization request, but it is also important to ensure that all relevant parties are included in the drafting process and consulted during the informal consultation. So what are the roles of the different actors? While the European Commission sets the content and deadlines included in the standardization request, these are developed in close consultation with the ISOs and other relevant stakeholders such as the Annex 3 organization and member states. And they can contribute all along the drafting phase of the request. Close cooperation between SEN and ISO, or Senelec and DIC is also important because, as you know, the same members are members of ISO and the Senelec members are members of DIC. So Sen and Senelec support international standardization and the technical alignment in Europe. So it's really important for us to make sure that everybody within the standardization family is consulted. And to ensure prompt coordination and input by all relevant stakeholders at European and international level during the drafting of the standardization request, so which means as soon as CCMC, Sensenec or its members have heard about a standardization project, we set up what we call the standardization request ad hoc group, which involve people from CCMC, the Sensenec Management Center, technical experts who are involved in technical committees, but also members of Sen and Senec, staff members, and also people from ISO and IEC if relevant, in order to create this consensus. And so the standardization ad hoc group, or SHRAG, its objective is to advise the technical boards of Senec on any issues related to the standardization request, including the work to be carried out and, for instance, the resources which are associated to the draft standardization request. Because at the end, when this standardization request is developed based on market needs, based on the need of the member states, on the need of the European Commission, the approval relies with the European Standardization Organization. But before that, the proposed draft standardization requests are submitted to the Committee on Standards, which is also established under the Regulation 2025. And once approved by the Committee on Standards, they are finally transmitted to the European Standardization Organization for acceptance and execution.
There's a question we don't understand. So then, if there is a relevant piece of legislation or policy, the Commission comes to Sen and Senelec and says, I would like to request if you would like to develop a standard or technical specification or report in this area to support the implementation of legislation. So this is called the standardization request. Then once this request comes to Sen and Senelec, Sen and Senelec have a specific group which examines the request.
Yes.
At the same time, there is the Committee of Standards, which is a European Commission group, right? Or what kind of group is that?
So this is a group which is established by the European Commission and which involves member states and European Standardization Organization. So it's a group which, let's say, examines the proposal made by the European Commission and finally validates the standardization request so that it can be formally transmitted to the European Standardization Organization.
And there is two parallel processes there, one taking place at Sen and one at the Committee of Standards, Sen and Senelec, and one at the Committee of Standards.
Yes.
To examine the standardization request.
Yes, exactly, Spiro. Yes. And once the standardization request is approved by the Committee on Standard, it is transmitted to Sen, Senec, or ETSI, and which have the possibility to accept or reject this standardization request. So this is also the role of what I mentioned, the SHRAG, which needs to advise at the end the Sen and Senec governing body on the possibility to accept or reject the standardization request based on different consideration, technical consideration, but also in terms of resources. And it's
what is the role of the technical committees in this standardization request acceptance? Are they involved in this? Are they expected to raise any issues, risks, or relevant aspects that need to be considered?
Yes, they are involved in this SHRAG, and as I mentioned, it's really important that in Europe we support technical alignment with international standardization and the request emanating from the European Union or the European Commission. So the technical experts will be involved to discuss with us, with all the stakeholders, to see what kind of standards are already available, if there are gaps, and if the standardization request will bring an added value for the industry in Europe. So you can see that we need all kind of expertise when discussing about standardization requests. On the technical side, on the policy side, it's really important to address those different aspects. And last but not least, it's also important to mention that a standardization request is a legal act, and it is considered as a contract between the European Commission and CEN or CENELEC, and thus is binding on both parties. So as you can see, many actors are involved in the preparation, which is initiated by the Commission, which involves the ISO, the stakeholders. The approval is on the responsibility of the European Standardization Organization. Then they are executed by by CEN, CENELEC, or NETI, and more specifically by the experts in the technical committees. And of course, CCMC, the CEN, CENELEC Management Center, support this kind of machinery and acts as the interface with the European Commission. And as always, just to finalize this part, we have to keep in mind the national delegation principle to get consensus for the preparation of the standardization request, to get consensus for the approval, and also to get consensus for the execution of the request.
And I think, Constant, as you mentioned also earlier, and based and linking with the previous aspects, then whenever CEN and CENELEC and SRAG is considering the acceptance of standardization request, it is going to make an evaluation of relevant aspects and risks or implications which are associated with such acceptance. For example, if a standardization request is linked to a legislation which makes the standard mandatory, then this needs to be considered also by this SRAG group. Therefore, there is an expectation to experts and technical committees to raise these issues as they know, probably they're aware of these issues already at this stage. So I think this is something that we need to highlight as a role and expectation from the technical groups.
Yeah, exactly. Because we have the opportunity within CEN/CENELEC to count on different kind of expertise, different kind of background. So it's really important when we enter this kind of process that this expertise is around the table to really detect all the details which may have an impact on the CEN/CENELEC system, but also on the technical deliverables at the end.
Okay. Bertrand Pigneur speaking, account manager finance. I would like to thank my both colleagues for introducing the whole background, which will be useful to explain you with some highlights how to get funding. As Spiro mentioned earlier, we do not expect to provide a very high level of details regarding the practical aspect to get funding, but just to raise awareness on the process to get funding and to develop whenever needed specific trainings to go more into details. So I would like to recall what Constant mentioned about the standardization requests, which is negotiated at the level of the standardization request at the group. As he mentioned, this is a contract. So it is really a very important document because this is the basis that will provide the framework for the future funding requests that I will explain, and that's why elements like planning for the development of the standardization request is really essential, and this is the right step for negotiating a good planning in order to ensure that whenever the funding will be requested, there won't be any timing issue which might have financial impact on the payment to the partners involved in the project. So as soon as the standardization request has been negotiated, the technical committee will be invited to submit a description, high-level description of the project to the STBT Working Group 217, who is in charge to prioritize the project to be funded with European funding, because we have financial constraints. So it's not possible to provide funding to all projects that we receive. So this STBT working group was set in order to define priorities between all projects that will be submitted for evaluation, and this evaluation will occur based on qualitative and quantitative criteria, for which there will be a score and then a ranking. So as soon as the STBT working group has provided its green lights on the project, the TC will be invited to prepare a quotation. Needless to say that to prepare a quotation as well as the project description for the STBT working group 217, we have specific templates to make your life easier. This quotation will be submitted to CCMC for review to also allow us to give you advices, but still bearing in mind the expectations of the standardization requests in terms of content, in terms of planning, because as Constance said, this is really the key document for starting the work, the technical work, and for which we will request funding. In this quotation, well, in this quotation we will have a description of the technical work, but also a description of the budget needed to develop this work. And this work can be pre-standardization work or some standardization work, for which a budget will be described in the quotation and submitted to the Commission for evaluation. So at this stage, this is just an offer. So the Commission and EFTA remain completely free to make comments, to reject the proposal, obviously we then work closely as CCMC with the help of our members to address the comments raised by the Commission. And as soon as the quotation is approved, we then start in the legal aspect, because a contract will be signed between SEN or Senelec with the Commission and EFTA. In this contract, you will find obviously commitments and also description of the payment steps. So generally, you have 3 steps. You have one first step, which is a step 0 called signature step, where you will receive most of the time 25% of the budget as pre-financing to allow you to start the work. Then there will be an interim stage, allowing the Commission to have a view on the progress of the work, and where there will be also funding allocated. Usually we are around 50% of the total budget agreed with EC and EFTA. And then a final step where the balance will be paid regarding the deliverables that will be provided at the end of the project. So deliverable can be standards, can be technical specifications, CWAs, guides, financial support to translation of standards. And these deliverables will be assessed by the Commission, but in parallel to a financial report where CCMC will collect all costs incurred, so all evidences supporting the cost justification of the standard of the standardization work that was performed. Because as you might know, we receive public funding, and hence it is quite obvious that we need to justify how this public funding was spent. During also this phase, we also provide advices, trainings to TCs to help them to manage efficiently the cost incurred in the project. So as soon as the financial report and the technical report are approved through an EC review, we receive as CCMC the payment. So we receive the reimbursement of the costs because, as you might know, the reimbursement is based on real cost. So it's not a fixed price provided, except in some specific cases that I won't develop today, but that we can discuss during another webinar or training. This payment is then transferred to the members, and within 5 years after the last payment, the Commission is allowed to perform any audit on the cost incurred and report it to them within the cost justification phase. So it's very important to ensure that you maintain all evidences in your accounting system. You should also know that on the principle, the European Commission and EFTA do not fund at 100% the whole cost. Only a part of the cost is funded because the objective is also to ask actors on the market who are asking for funding to also find alternate funding to complete funding needs. So it's very important to have this process on mind to figure out how to request funding, how the funding is managed, and how to also secure the funding in case of audit. Obviously, for all of these steps, you can count on CCMC to provide all the needed support. So now that we have the deliverable which is available, there are obviously questions about IPRs. And for that, I will give back the floor to my colleague Spiro, who will explain you all of these aspects.
Thank you, Bertrand. But before going there, actually, and I think that was very important what you mentioned, that in this case, we're not talking just about EU financing. We're talking about co-funding and co-financing of the development of the standards.
Indeed.
So perhaps I think it's important there to distinguish what this means and what costs it covers with that regard, and what other costs are not covered and which need to be addressed by the standardization bodies, experts, and industry with that regard, and stakeholders.
Yes, indeed, Spiro, it is a very good question because as you might imagine, within a budget we have different kind of costs, where you have the staff cost of the TC and of SEN and SENELEC members involved in the standardization development, where only a part is paid by the Commission. And also we have travel costs and subcontractor costs, because you might need to work with laboratories to provide some input to develop the deliverables, where there is a funding at 100%. But out of that, you don't have any financial support for marketing costs, for dissemination costs. So this is just focused on some aspect of the standard development. But there is also nothing covering anything related to the sales of the standards. So because here the process is only covering the development of the standard and nothing else.
Thank you. But because that's very important, there is indeed sometimes confusion in the environment that we operate, whereby there is a perception that the Commission is funding everything, and so there is a question there placed also with regard to the access an IPR of the deliverables later in the process. However, it is important here to clearly note and point that actually this is a co-funding, partial co-funding for the development only of some deliverables. It doesn't mean that all the deliverables of technical committees are being funded through this process. Maybe some of them are funded, but not all of them, because it also depends on what the Commission and the EFTA will agree to finance, depends on their priorities as well. And sometimes, I think you can confirm that sometimes maybe even harmonized deliverables standards may not necessarily be funded or co-funded by the Commission.
No.
So it's not always the case. Plus, take into account what we mentioned earlier, that only 20% of the catalog is harmonized standards. The other 70% is not harmonized standards, and normally there is no EU funding for those. What this means is that the standardization bodies, CEN and CENELEC, need to bear the cost of the entire system. So the 100%, but particularly for the other 70%, and for the 20% which is not funded, because this is a co-funding as well. So it means that the costs are much larger than what is covered for the development itself. So there are operational costs which for CCMC, for CEN, CENELEC, but also for the members at the European level to be able to operate and provide services at national level to the users of the standards and implementers. So that is very important and has an impact also on later on the IPR, as I mentioned, and dissemination, and how the perception is being shaped at the European level from industry, from stakeholders, but also from the regulator, the European Commission, Parliament and Council.
Yes, indeed, Spiro. And as you mentioned, there are some stages like which are not funded. If we take, by instance, the preparation of the proposal, so the quotation is not funded, and we know that it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to build up this proposal, and that is not funded. So indeed, this is really a co-funding partially, and this is only for the development of the standard only.
Okay. Thank you, Bertrand. By the way, if you have any questions later about this process, because I see already some questions, Bertrand, who is our expert, our master in this domain, can provide some more information and reply to your questions with that regard. So we're going to continue next to the next item. And by the way, apologies for my voice. I have a cold, so maybe it doesn't sound that great to you, but I'll do my best to keep it at high level. Further to that, after what Bertrand described about the development phase and the funding, co-funding for the development of some harmonized deliverables, it is important to go to the next stage, which is the availability and dissemination of the European standards as such. And then there are some issues which are being raised there with regard to the IPR and specifically the copyrights of the deliverables and what this means for the users eventually. So for that, I will try to go step by step and describe how the process works. And I'm not going to describe how the technical committees develop the deliverables. I will focus only on the elements which are relevant for establishing the copyright of the deliverables or the publications for CEN and CENELEC. For that purpose, it is important to note that CEN and CENELEC have a common policy with regard to the IPR and dissemination of the final deliverables. This is the CEN-CENELEC Guide 10. You can find it available on the CEN and CENELEC website. You can download it and review it. It's publicly available in order to ensure also there is transparency and a clear framework for the members, but also for the users with that regard. And it also is important to note that this guide defines some principles for the dissemination of deliverables. Why this is important? It is important because CEN and CENELEC as such do not distribute or sell standards. The dissemination, distribution, and sales of standards takes place by the national standardization bodies and national committees, members of CEN and CENELEC. So the sales point and access points of standards are the national standardization bodies and national committees, members of CEN and CENELEC. So if you want to get access, you should go to your national member, whoever you would choose to get access to. So the guide only defines some principles, the implementation and specific aspects of how what kind of license to get, what type of price, for example, is defined. This is determined individually by each member of SENESELEC at national level. So it is not be decided centrally. There is no common pricing or anything else, and that's appropriate also in order to ensure that there is a respect with regard to principles of a free market and competition also with that regard. So now going a bit further to understand is how SENESELEC establish the copyright of the deliverable. So as you may know, experts come together at the technical committees to develop the standards. So the experts collectively, they contribute something for the development of the standard, the state of the art. It is not always clear or distinguishable what content each expert has contributed, because there is discussion, there is consensus, so the text may change throughout the development phase. So in order to ensure some coherence and clarity with that regard, what we have in the SENESELEC system is what we call an expert's assignment of exploitation rights. So the experts at the beginning of each meeting, whenever they sign the attendance form, they also sign a statement under which they agree to grant to SENESELEC, for the benefit of their members, the exploitation rights, the copyright essentially, to their individual contributions. So what this means is that they transfer these exploitation rights to SENESELEC collectively, so in order to ensure that the final deliverable is indeed a copyrightable material, and which SENESELEC can further provide to the members for distribution. And this ensures this compliance also with the appropriate legislative framework for IPR with that regard. And this is why it has been designed in such a way. Now, it is important also to consider that sometimes, as Bertrand mentioned, there are cases where work may be delegated or subcontracted to other organizations outside. So in that case, there might be some issues there raised which are related to the IPR as well. For example, the Commission might provide a request for development of some deliverables, a report or something else. They may have a list of expected deliverables out of this project. Some of these might be subcontracted for development to an external provider. So what happens with them in that case? Who has the IPR and how we do that? In that case, it's very, very important to ensure that whenever such subcontracting takes place, that the IPR is clear. And why this is important? Because sometimes the subcontracting takes place and the contract rather for that purpose is signed between one of the SENESELEC members and the subcontractor directly, not always between SENESELEC and the subcontractor. So when the members sign such contracts with subcontractors, they need to ensure that the provisions for the IPR or the final deliverables are provided and are ensured that they are indeed established as SEN and SENELEC IPR ownership. And that's very important because there is an obligation towards the European Commission to ensure that this takes place, but also it's very important because such content may be used for the development and publication of SENESELEC deliverables, so standards, technical reports, technical specifications. So it is important that whenever such content is being used, SENESELEC have the appropriate rights to be able to produce their final deliverable and provide to the members clear with regard to the IPR context as well. So in this case, no one will also be able to challenge such dissemination by the members, since it has been defined already in the contract that SENESELEC have the IPR for that. Of course, there is also flexibility in that context. What this means is that we understand that sometimes a subcontractor could be a research organization, for example. They may also need to use such content for their own purposes. So sometimes their benefit is not only monetary, but could also be to the ability to use the final deliverable, because it also serves their purpose with that regard. So in that context, there is a possibility to allow them to take a license to use such content for their own purposes, and as far as such use does not contradict the final SENESELEC deliverable. What it means is that, for example, they can use it to publish a book or a research paper, for example, but not to develop a standard which contradicts the content of the SENESELEC standard, for example, because this would indeed inhibit the very purpose of the development phase and the contribution from this organization. So there is a possibility for them to use it. However, it has to be done in a way which makes sense with that regard. And we understand also that organizations need also to be able to use such content for their own purposes, and there is a flexibility for that. So very important then, whenever there is a subcontracting, IPR has to be clear with that regard due to the obligations we have, but also for the practical aspect of dissemination of the deliverables. Now, eventually the question comes to why is this IPR and this copyright important? There is why should there be such protection for the standards themselves? So the protection is very important because it ensures that whenever there is a misuse, SENEC and the members can take steps to address them. Imagine, for example, the case where someone takes Euro codes, they upload it on a website which they have created without appropriate licensing, without appropriate permission, and users go to this website, they download and use the Euro codes. What this means is that such individual or organization which will upload the content may also change the content itself. No one can guarantee that. No one can guarantee that the content which is provided in such website is the accurate, official, authoritative text published by SENEC and distributed by the members. So a user implementer going to such website has the risk of actually implementing something which is not correct. So later, if something is done in such a way, in such a manner, the risk of regulatory non-compliance is very high. They run a very serious problem there. So this is something that needs to be taken into account. So whenever SENEC take notice of such practice taking place, we take actions to address it and take down such content. Also legal actions are necessary in coordination very often with our members, but also with ISO and IC as relevant. Also, copyright gives an added value to the deliverables itself. It provides a recognition. Since there is a copyright, there is a different perception in the market of the content itself. Regardless of what the practical aspects could be by itself, the fact is that from even psychological perspective, the value added to a content when it is protected as copyright is different than if it is not. And certainly there is a certain recognition in the market for such content. At the same time, the copyright ensures that there is alignment at the international level, because SENEC also align their policies with ISO and IC international level. ISO and IC have the same policy as SENEC with regard to the protection of the content under copyright. So also at ISO and IC, deliverables are not made available free of charge. They are protected as copyrights and have been distributed under a fee by the members. So this ensures also that by being protected as copyrights, at the same time, there is a possibility by ISO and IC to take up for adoption at international level the relevant deliverables and ensure at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, that the deliverables can be used by industry, company stakeholders to implement them and sell their products and services inside Europe, but also outside Europe in order to maximize their profits as well. At the same time, this is very important, and this is a crucial element here to consider, is that copyrights and the ability for the members to sell and distribute the deliverables is because it ensures the sustainability and independence of the European standardization system. As Bertrand mentioned earlier, the Commission provides partial co-funding for the development of deliverables. However, there are many other costs which are associated for that. So at the same time, in order to ensure, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the European standardization system is market-driven, it needs to be able to be sustainable and independent itself. So market-driven means ability to develop standards independently from regulators, governments, and anyone who would like to have an outgrowth influence to the development itself. So the funds which the members take from the sales of the standards ensures that they can provide this and reinvest it in their activities, in the operational aspects, and the innovation in the development phase as well of the standards, in order to ensure that they are also sustainable and they can survive in this competitive market. Because at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, being market-driven means that the development phase needs to be considered market trends and not only regulatory perspectives as well. Regulatory perspective is one aspect. Stakeholder needs, industry needs are also a different aspect which needs to be considered as well in the development phase. And such independence is ensured through the sustainability, financial sustainability of the system itself. Now, a final point which I would like to mention is about the access to the standards itself. So after the development phase, establishing the copyright, what happens, where can you get the standards? So SEN and SENELEC have an agreement with their members under which, and this is also described in the SEN and SENELEC Guide 10, under which SEN and SENELEC transfer all the rights for the exploitation of deliverables, the final deliverables, to their members. Why this is such? Because, as I mentioned, members of SEN and SENELEC are the ones which sell, distribute, disseminate the standards. So anyone who needs to get access gets national access to deliverables to the members. Of course, the members have contracts with publishing houses and other organizations which offer the standards online, whereby the users can access them as they wish. Any user can get to the website of any member of SEN and SENELEC in any country and get whichever standard they want. Of course, there might be some differences due to national annexes, or because there might be language differences which facilitate the implementation in one country to the other. And this is indeed the added value to that. So the members of SEN and SENELEC, the national committees and national standardization bodies, are a natural contact point for the implementers at national level. They have the ability to communicate in a national language. They have the ability to offer services and guidance to help the users to implement the standards. And certainly this is an increased facilitation in order to minimize the costs for implementation and compliance with the relevant legislation with that regard. So this is very, very important. Sometimes we have received, particularly lately, some requests, we would prefer standards to be made available through the SEN and SENELEC website, for example. However, what this does is that it removes the element of the ability to receive additional support from the national members of SEN and SENELEC through the direct interaction with these organizations. And SEN and SENELEC members have developed specific tools and services to help implementers with that regard. So it is very important to be able to get national access to the standards with that regard. At the same time, there is some flexibility to the system with regard to specific aspects which have been identified as relevant to provide centralized access. For example, in the cases of the CWAs, the ICT and R&D domain, Guide 10 provides that this can be made available on the SEN and SENELEC website following pre-financing, pre-funding of the access by the participants to the workshop. So the CWAs, by the way, it's workshop agreements, SEN or SENELEC workshop agreements, developed by a limited number of participants for example, in an area and domain where they think that they would like to develop a specific standardization deliverable recognized by SEN and SENELEC. There is a possibility also later for this to become a standard, for example, although it will require more wide consensus by industry and stakeholders with that regard. However, in this case, in the ICT and R&D domain, there has been identified need to make them available through the SEN and SENELEC websites. With that regard, in order to ensure also the sustainability of the system for the independence, as I mentioned earlier, there is also a need to ensure that there is a pre-funding, a pre-financing, a prepayment for the access rights to be granted with that regard. So I think that's from me. We provide here some contacts for relevant questions that you may have after this discussion, because we understand that here we only try to go through and get you to the process and how more high-level aspects and issues raised. However, you may have more questions at a more detailed level. So for that aspect, my colleagues here, me and myself and the other colleagues will be happy to raise and address the relevant questions you may have for that.
Yeah. Maybe you can just briefly mention the point of contact. So as you can see here, if you have questions regarding standard dissemination policy and IPR, you may contact Spiro. For standards development and SHRAG, please contact Constant. For contracts and audits, please contact me. And for quotations, preparation and documents to prepare for the STBT Working Group 217, please contact our colleague Sébastien Ouman, who is project manager, members, technical board. You have all the email addresses, so feel free to contact us if you have questions or if there are specific training needs.